We are in a sermon series on the book of Ephesians. Martin Luther said Ephesians was the queen of the epistles. And why did he have such a high standard, and why did he think so much of Ephesians? Because grace is explained over and over and over again. Grace is being a gift. Grace is being something you cannot earn or buy. Grace being something that is God's gift. Grace being available to all people who are willing to accept it. Ephesus itself was an important city in the first century. It was located in present-day Turkey. It had a very high reputation. It was a port city, although he had to go on a river that's now dry. But it was a major place for commerce to take place, and East and West met there. Paul was in Ephesus for 3 years and started the church and gave it a chance to get started. And he cared about those folks deeply and wanted to let them know how much God's grace was there for them. We're going to be looking at chapter 3 today. Last week we looked at chapter 2. This week we're looking at 3. Next week we're looking at 4. So if you think ahead, you might be able to figure out where we're going over the next few weeks. There's only 6 chapters in the epistle, so it's not going to take us a whole lot of time to get through it. But it's such an important book, I think, because it keeps coming back to grace. Today we're going to be taking a look, though, at the part of the text that you heard read to you where Paul was praying for the church in Ephesus. And by praying, I mean he said in the discourse, I pray that God strengthen you with power. So his first prayer request for his church was that they would be strengthened with power. Now, a lot of folks don't understand how God's power works, but there's a wonderful teaching story in Exodus 16 that shows us how God's power is intended to be used. In chapter 16 of Exodus, Moses is in the wilderness with his folks that are complaining, we don't have enough food, we don't have enough to drink, we don't have enough meat. They were whiners. What can I say? So Moses goes to God and said, I've got a bunch of whiners here. What are you going to do about it? And God says, I'll tell you what. I will provide manna every day. There'll be manna outside every tent, and everybody can take as much manna as they need. It'll be there every day. Manna is a Hebrew word that stands for what means, what is it? They didn't know what it was, but it tasted sweet. It was a bread-like thing. And sure enough, it was outside their tents. But God said, you need to remember something about this. I will provide it for you every day. Don't store it up. Well, can you imagine a bunch of whiners being told that they couldn't store it? So what do the whiners do? They store it in the corner of their tent. And what happens? It turns into maggots overnight. The message that God was giving Israel was, the strength that you need, the food that you need will be there when you need it. You don't get to stockpile it. And I had a beautiful example of how this story worked out in real life. In a previous church I was serving, I had the unfortunate privilege of doing a funeral for a 5-year-old who had died from congenital heart issues. The father was a professional musician, and he wanted to sing at the funeral. But he said, Mark, I don't know if I can get through it. And I said, well, Joe, relax. If you can't get through it, everybody's going to understand. But I told him the story about the manna. I told him the story about God's grace will be there. The strength that you need will be there when you need it. Not in advance, but as you go through it. So the day of the funeral, those tiny caskets are a real brutal thing to see. Came time in the service for Dad to sing the song that he wanted to sing with his guitar. And he stood up and he started to sing, There wasn't a dry eye in the place except Joe's. He sang the entire lullaby without a hitch. And for me, it was a wonderful example of what the power is. God's power comes to us. It doesn't get stockpiled like a battery, but it is there when we need it. And the important thing that I think Paul was saying to the church in Ephesus is, I pray that it will strengthen you with power. When you need it, it will be there. And my guess is almost everyone in this room can think back in a time in your life when you were faced with a disaster or a difficulty or a challenge. You think, how am I going to get through this? And guess what? You did. You're here now. And you can look back on it and say, you know what? God provided what I needed then. And God always will. So the first prayer request that Paul made was that we would be strengthened from within. The second one is so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. That's such an important thing. This is the getting back to the core of the gospel that Luther was so fond of in Ephesians. As Paul keeps hammering home, it's by faith, not by works. Last week we heard that term, it's not by works, so no one can boast. I did it, I was so good. No, that's not how it works. It's faith. God's faithfulness to us in providing us the strength we need and the grace that we need to be forgiven. Can't earn it, can't buy it, but it's there available to us. Grace is available to all people through faith, not works. Remember, we said it last week. We do the works because we're grateful for the grace we've been given. We don't do the works to earn the grace. And so it's constantly a reminder for us that God's grace is going to be there for us. Then he goes on to say in the text, to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ. If you've ever had a chance to be on a cruise ship in the Mediterranean, it's a very interesting experience because when you sit, Christy and I were on a cruise in the Mediterranean, and this text came to mind because remember, Paul did 3 missionary journeys through the Mediterranean area. And what he wanted to impress upon the people that he was talking to in Ephesus is God's love is bigger than this sea that we're looking at. The Mediterranean Sea is 2,500 miles east to west. It averages 4,900 feet deep. It has 22 countries that border on it. It has 3,000 islands, including 2 nation islands. But I think when Paul was doing his crisscrossing on his missionary journeys and he kept seeing this huge body of water, that reminded him of how deep and high and long God's love is for us. Think about that. God's love for you and God's love for me is more than 2,500 miles, more than 4,900 feet deep. It's available to everyone, all 22 nations. It's something that Paul was giving them a visual reminder that God's grace was wider, deeper, further than anything they could imagine. Living in Las Vegas, we don't have much of an ocean picture until California drops into the ocean, and then we'll have beach property. But until that happens, we're going to be faced with the reality of knowing God's love for us is far greater than we can describe or imagine. Well, what does this mean for the Lakes Lutheran Church? I love this text where Paul said, let's read it together. Now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than we ask or imagine. Imaginably more than we could ask or imagine. God is going to have for us a future. God knows who the next pastor is going to be. That pastor doesn't know who they are, he or she is. But there's going to be someone out there in the United States that's going to say, you know what, I feel called when this call committee talks to me, and the call committee is going to interview them and give them a chance to say, this is a place where you can come and grow and do ministry. And we can't imagine how it's going to happen, because there are thousands of pastors in the ELCA. There are 9,000 congregations. How are we ever going to find that needle in the haystack? And I don't worry about it, because God is able to do immeasurably more than I can ask or imagine. So God has got the pastor in mind, and will be preparing that pastor's heart and mind to be here. And when that person arrives, they're going to be very lucky to have this call. Because, believe it or not, you're a great group to work with. In spite of what I heard before I came. God will empower our church to grow. And so often we see ourselves as, well, we don't have a future. Yes, you do have a future, because God is able to do, say it again, immeasurably more than we can think or even ask. Someday all these seats will be filled. And they'll be filled with people who are looking to grow in their faith. They're looking to become the people of faith that God has called them to be. We don't know who those people are, but they will be here. And we can believe and we can trust God to help us do that. God will deepen our personal faith. And part of what I think is so important is we think church can be about just getting together, but it really is about a personal faith. We're lucky as Lutherans, we get it all done in an hour or less. I've told you before, the Etrians meet here on Thursday. They start at 6 a.m. and quit at noon. Every Thursday. 6 hours it takes them to get what we get done in an hour. We're just so efficient. That's because we're into grace, see? It just keeps oozing out of every place. But the church exists not to be something unto itself, but to help individuals grow in faith. And that's what excites me about what's going to happen, because God is able to do in your life immeasurably more than you can think or imagine. 1 year ago today, I had no clue I would be here. 5 years ago today, I had no clue I would be here. 15 years ago, I had no clue I would be here. But I can tell you this, that 49 years ago, when I started out as a pastor, I never dreamed I would end up in Las Vegas. Thank you, Lord. Save me from the tundra. Happiest day of my life was when I got rid of my snowblower and lawnmower. God will reveal our future one step at a time. And like the children of Israel who wanted to store stuff up in the corner because they weren't sure God was going to provide in the future, what I can assure you is, for the last 4,000 years, God has been providing for individuals, for countries, for congregations, for people of faith. And God will continue to do immeasurably more than you can think or imagine today and into the future. Was that a miracle or what? I'm at the end of my sermon and the lights go out. It's a sign from God, I'm sure. Shut up, Mark. Be done. God will help us find a new pastor. God will empower us to grow. God will deepen our personal faith, and God will reveal our future one day at a time. But God will be with us each and every one of those days. Thanks be to God. Amen.